This is our 68th lesson, and I'm Marion Fox. We're looking at the second edition of my book on the biblical flood, and we'll be looking at some more suggested studies. It's in chapter 16 of the book. We're looking at the post-diluvian Mediterranean Sea, what it looked like after the flood. Post means after the flood. We'll be looking at what's called the Zankian Flood. It's actually misnamed, but we'll look at how they got that name. And we'll make some suggestions for additional study to be made to help to clarify and to see if some of the predictions I make are in fact true, if they come to pass. I claim to be a prophet, but I'm saying my flood model would lead to certain things. In 1970, that's several years ago, about 22 years ago, 52 years ago, I guess, a group of scientists drilled in the Mediterranean Sea and drew several conclusions from their drilling. That caused a furor when they drilled and found out some things. And there was a bunch of scientists that became really excited about this. Some greatly opposed it at first, but eventually they were won over. One conclusion was that the Mediterranean had dried up at one time, probably two times in the past, completely dried up. And so there was just small lakes down in some low areas. That's all there was. That was one of the conclusions. A man named Kenneth Sue contended that the water in the Mediterranean basin evaporated and the basin became a desert. By and large, there were just some small lakes in the low areas and that were left. And the contention was challenged by a man named Stanley, but he has been overridden since then, Stanley's view. Now let's look at the Mediterranean seafloor. We can see here that we see the lower levels. My mouse is moving around. Then there's an area that's even above sea level now. This is right now. Then there's a sill or shelf right across here on a blocking below the sea level. And it gets deep again over here in this region and over here. So we have up in here a deep region and a shallow region here. Here's the Black Sea over here. And I guess Romania is about right in here, Chris, where you said you went out into the Black Sea a little bit, right in this region right here, I think, about right here. And so right over here is Ukraine, and this is where a lot of the fighting's going on right now, right? That's the Black Sea. Here's Turkey, and there's the Straits of Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits. We'll be talking about those just in a little bit. That's the Mediterranean seafloor, and up here is the Iberian Peninsula. That would be Portugal up here in Spain. And so there's a boundary, I guess, between Spain and France. France up here. England is over here, up in this, about up above to the upper left. Any questions about that? That's what the seafloor looks like. It's important that we kind of get a picture of what it looks like before we get into this study. Our Mediterranean Basin program, now, this is a quote, so we'll get you the source in a minute. You have the book, so you have the references. I've added some things to the book, and so I'll try to send this to you again tonight. I added probably 2 more pages to it. Our Mediterranean Basin program team at the Smithsonian Institution, however, does not, in the case of the large Western Basin during the salinity crisis, confirmed depths in excess of 2,500 meters as proposed by Sue and others, or does for the much shallower 200 to 500 meters basin as indicated by Nesterov. So they're kind of trying to go between the two, their claim. Now this is several years ago. Rather, our measurements of the Western Basin indicate moderate bathyal depths from at least 200 to as deep as 1,500 meters. That's pretty deep. 1,500 meters is, that's about 5,000 feet, about a mile deep. So a meter is 3.28 feet in the meter, roughly. Okay. Matthews concludes, now these are earlier quotes, now keep this in mind, concludes, we'll get some later quotes in just a minute. He concludes that the Mediterranean basin was a desert which was refilled by a breach in the Strait of Gibraltar, page 21 of Matthew. And this is the same source up here. Now, here's what they claim it looked like. That is, it dried up, and here is the Rhone River, and there's some other rivers feeding into it. Now this, right across here is a higher region, and here, higher region right here. So that this was all the water here. This was a lake, and it was a very salty lake, because as it dried up, and as it would rain, any salt that was up here would be carried down into this. It's like the Dead Sea or the Great Salt Lake in Utah in the United States. Very similar to that. Here's the Rhone River. Now, what we're going to get into just in a minute, we'll have some quotes to prove this, that the amount of water running into the Mediterranean Sea from these three rivers and the Nile down here, and another river coming out of the Black Sea, mostly these three rivers, and rainfall was not near enough if there wasn't water coming out of the Atlantic Ocean through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean Sea would dry up. And they claim it did dry up, and the evidence, I believe, is conclusive that it did dry up. I would argue, my claim is that this was full of water after the flood. This whole basin was filled with water, and it dried up because there was basically a dam across here. The water could not get in from the Atlantic. And as it dried up, this may explain the problems that Abraham and Isaac had whenever they went down, and Jacob, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had going down into Egypt because of famine. It may have been that as this dried up, the rainfall slowed considerably and was reduced considerably. But here, these would be salty, much like the Dead Sea and the Great Salt Lake in the United States. So these are some of your rivers feeding it, and the main rivers, but they don't get near enough water from the rivers and rainfall to keep it full. The evaporation rate is 3 times higher than the rate that comes in. As we see here, it came across a breach right in here. The Straits of Gibraltar were right in here. And water began to flow out of the Atlantic into it. We've already talked about this in the prior lesson, but the entire refilling may have taken only a century. It would have dropped the whole world sea level by about 40 feet. So once this dries up, the water has to go somewhere. It evaporates and goes into the air, and it rains down and goes into the oceans. So as this water comes out of the Mediterranean, it'll raise the sea level about 40 feet. That's a considerable rise. We've already gone through and seen how the coastal regions, the land on the coastal regions went further out on the continental shelves, and people were living as deep as 150, 200 feet, maybe even 300 feet, but what is now but sea level. And they found archaeological sites where people live there, and it fits in. And the flood model fits in with that too, my flood model. If the refilling of the Mediterranean basin would drop the world sea level about, if the refilling would drop the world sea level about 40 feet, the evaporation of it would result in a rise of 40 feet. So we'd see about 40 feet, the refilling would drop the sea level. So whenever it evaporated out of it and was pulled out of it, that made it rise by about 40 feet. This poses a problem for the atheists, not for my flood model, though it doesn't pose a problem. Now, here's how they visualize it. That is that this began to come through the Straits of Gibraltar. Here's Gibraltar. This is Spain up here. This is England up here. And there's France. And so right here is Africa. And the water began to flow through here, down, cutting down through here and filling this up. Now, the water, some claim that it flowed so rapidly that it could fill it up in a matter of 6 or 8 months. And that's pretty fast. And that would be a drastic change in the sea level, dropping about 40 feet. The rest of the ocean level is dropping by 40 feet. And that would trigger a lot of problems throughout the earth. But right in here is this water, this heavy water in here. It weighs down on the crust and it creates volcanoes and earthquakes as well, both. And we'll see this. Yeah, this would partially account for the rapid rise in sea level after the flood that we've already proven to have occurred because of archaeological sites called undersea archaeology on the continental shelves. I'll show you a map here in just a few minutes in this lesson. We'll quickly go through it because we've already studied this. Other conclusions were drawn from the facts by these scientists. First, there's archaeological evidence that the Mediterranean Sea was considerably lower than it is at the present time. By archaeological, I mean we have artifacts proving that people lived in these lower regions. So that's a very interesting situation. In 1985, that's quite a while ago, Henri Koskier, a professional deep sea diver, discovered a narrow underwater opening barely 9 feet by 3 beneath the base of a cliff rising from the Mediterranean Sea, located in the Calais region, area between Marseille and Cassis. I don't know my French, so I'm probably not pronouncing these words correctly. The cave was 110 feet below sea level. That's quite deep. And Clotes and Courtin, and this was published in 1993, page 64. The cave has Paleolithic art on the walls, evidence that it was above sea level at one time for people to come into the cave. And so that's evidence of it. Clotes and Courtin claim, here's a quote of them, evidence tells us that ancient people went into the Kosker cave during at least 2 different periods. So they see at least 2 different times people came into that cave. Now the evidence shows that the Mediterranean Sea was, the level of the sea was lowered and then was raised a little bit and then lowered again. And we'll show we've already gone through how that occurred, at least according to my model. And so during Paleolithic times, the sea level was about 360 feet lower than it is now. Now, how do they know that? Well, but they know that by archaeological evidence. They can't say that it wasn't lower than that, lower than 360 feet. They just know it was at least 360 feet. So when he says about, it should have been, he should have said at least, because his evidence showed it to be that deep, and that doesn't prove it wasn't deeper. And the coast was several miles away from the cliff. And in 1966, they discussed these caves extensively and began to examine them. Here's the cave, and here's your cliff, and this is a diagram of it. 36 meters. Now, meters, 39.37 inches, so about 3.28 feet per meter. So multiply your 36 by 3.28, you'll get a number of feet deep. Up this, then I assume a scuba diver went up through here, come out up in here, and now you come out where there's air, and there's your cave. And so this is the cave where people lived. People lived up in this area. Now, there's water in here now that the water is the same level as this right here. So that's your cave, and it's about 30 meters up there. Now, here's some of the artwork of drawings of people that they drew on the cave walls, the walls of the cave. That looks like a comes kind of a donkey-like animal, or maybe a zebra, but it looks like more like a donkey, perhaps a horse, but it's an animal like a horse or a donkey. This might be a bag like a cow, but we can't tell right here. So it looks like an animal like a horse, something like a horse. Here's another one. It shows handprints, and you can Google the Cosker Cave. I think I have one. No, I don't. You can Google Cosker Cave art and find a whole bunch of other pictures of other animals. I just put these two on, let you kind of see it. So this all is in that cave, and that cave was like 100 feet down under the water right now. So that tells you the water level was that low for people to come into that cave. And they say the archaeological evidence said the level of the Mediterranean was at least a mile away from the base of the cave. So it was even deeper. They say 360 feet. Second, there's not a sufficient amount of water supplied by the rivers to drain into the Mediterranean Sea and rainfall combined to replenish the water that evaporates. It evaporates faster than it comes in. Cloud states the annual loss of water by evaporation from the Mediterranean surface today exceeds by 3 times that added by all its tributary sources plus rainfall. So the only way that the Mediterranean Sea can contain and keep its level up is for water to come in out of the Atlantic Ocean through the Straits of Gibraltar, or Gibraltar Strait. I guess it's just one strait, Strait of Gibraltar. And water flows from the Atlantic into the Strait of Gibraltar at about a speed of about 3 or 4 or 5 miles per hour, about 4 or 5 knots. And so that's pretty rapid flow of water. Sailing ships had trouble. They had to get a strong east wind to get through the Straits of Gibraltar, because the water flow would keep them from going out into the Atlantic. So they had to wait until they had a strong east wind to push them through the straits. Now, of course, our diesel-powered and our nuclear-powered carriers and things like that, they can just continue right on through with their propellers. But at 3 times, the evaporation rate is 3 times the rate that the rivers and rainfall puts into the Mediterranean. So we got to have some other source. Since this is true, it's possible that extensive parts of the region were below sea level whenever it was not connected in any way, joined to the oceans. Third, there's evidence of extensive evaporation of the Mediterranean. We'll look at that evidence in a minute. Geoscientists have discovered 3 lakes of extremely salty brine lying in pockets on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea. Oceanographers have previously identified 2 other brine lakes in the Mediterranean during expeditions a decade ago. So we have about 5. So we had 2 plus 3 more makes 5 of these lakes. We'll look at these in just a minute. Regarding these brine lakes, Wallman states, we calculated the time taken to generate a measured profile using a simple one-dimensional transport model. And so we just have one source of transport into it. Our calculations indicate that the surface sediments have been in contact with magnesium chlorine brine for over 2,000 years. Within this short period, now 2,000 years would be back to the time of Christ. See, the discovery basin must have been filled at an average rate of almost 10 to the 5th. That was 100,000 m squared. That would be cubic meters, and that's per year. That's 100,000 cubic meters per year. And that's how many cubic meters, 100,000 per year. Fourth, Rauchi and St. Martin state According to major biological contributors, and despite minor fluctuations, two main intervals of sedimentation separated by a sedimentary gap may be distinguished. So now even a scientist claim that there's two intervals where it was filled and then evaporated and it filled again. My model explains how we had two of those. The atheistic model does not explain the two. Fifth, records of the later Neogene history, moreover, are not limited to the Mediterranean. So this is not just in the Mediterranean Sea. The evidence is extended by drill cores to the bottom of the Black Sea basin, when the Black Sea and Mediterranean basins were separate. They have not always been connected. And the evidence was that they weren't connected. I don't believe they were connected right after the flood. The connection occurred later. And they were separate. Influx from the Danube and these rivers, about 4 rivers there, and other Central and South European rivers transformed the Black Sea to a freshwater lake. So it became a freshwater lake at that time. Now, how do we know it was freshwater? Because the fossils that are in the lake at that time were deposited were not marine fossils. A marine fossil is a fossil that lives in the ocean. An aquatic fossil is one that lives in freshwater. They were aquatic fossils. It remained so, that is, it remained a freshwater lake until the first desiccation of the Mediterranean, which reorganization of the European drainage system diverted much of the Black Sea tributary water to the Mediterranean, accounting for local Eastern Mediterranean sediments with distinctive non-marine microfossils. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, there were non-marine microfossils, that is, fossils from freshwater at that time. So that tells us that the Black Sea then began to flow into the Mediterranean and brought these non-marine microfossils in. 6, Birkeland and Larsen state not only were the Aral and Caspian seas larger in the recent geological past, we'll look at those seas in just a minute with a map, than they are today, but they were connected with one another as well as with the Black Sea. So these three seas were connected together. Now here you can see the Scandinavian ice sheet, and there's Siberian ice sheet. Now I was right up in this region, right up in here whenever I went to Russia. But right here is the Caspian Sea. Here is the Black Sea. There's your Bosphorus Straits and the Dardanelles Straits. The water flows out of the Black Sea into the Aegean Sea, into the Mediterranean. That's the sea east of, here's what we call Greece. Now, the Aral Sea is right over here, just right off the map. But these three were all joined together, and the evidence is there because this is not a very high region. It's pretty low. And so the water went all the way across from here to here. These three were all joined together way over here. And it was from the ice that was melting up here. As these ice sheets melted and they flowed to the south, they couldn't go out because there was an ice dam up here. So the water flowed down these rivers into the Caspian and into the Black Sea and into the Aral Sea through the river down into here. All right. Here you can see your Aral Sea down here. There it is now. This is a modern map. There's your Caspian Sea, and the Volga goes into it. I was up on the northern end of the Volga whenever I went there at Yaroslavl, about 250 miles north of Moscow when I was there in 93, 94. And then we have the Sea of Ozo. Right here is Ukraine, where a lot of the fighting is going on right now. And right here's your Black Sea. So the Aral and the Caspian and the Black Sea this was all underwater. See right in here how low it is? Probably the water level went about right here and down into here, over into here, up. See, that's pretty low region over there, probably way over into here. They have evidence of it, the shorelines, and they have evidence showing that the water was there. This was all fresh water from the melting ice. Let's go back and look at our ice. As this ice melted, the water had to go somewhere. Couldn't go into the ocean up here because there's an ice dam up here on the north. Any questions? Now, we have what's called the Zen Playing Flood. They refer to the Zankian Flag, and this is discussed by Castellanos et al., and I have this reference to them. It's named after a period of time in geology that is part of the Pleistocene epoch. It's dated about 5.3 million years to 3.6 million years ago by the atheist geologic timescale, of course. I wouldn't date it that early by any means at all. Right. Blanc et al. Give a summary of this event, and this is new material in my book. And so here's your Zankian Flood, named after that period in geologic time, named after a city over here in this area. But right here, supposedly, it began to flow through the Straits of Gibraltar, and the water began to fill it up. As it filled it over here, the water rose, and finally it began to flow over here into this next region. This is a higher region right in here. And it began to flow into this once it filled this a certain amount. And again, they think it may have taken 2 years, some as quickly as 6 months to fill all of this, the water to flow into. That's a tremendous amount of water to flow. They claim that the water flow is like 30 or 40 times. We'll get it here in just a minute. The flow of the Amazon River, which is by far the biggest river in the world, the Amazon, which is, of course, in South America. There are several theories on how the Zankian Flood occurred, but let me go back and show you this. This right here was like a dam across here. The water can't get through. The atheist admits they can't explain how this occurred, and because they say, well, it was could have been plate tectonics, but plate tectonics goes too slowly, and this would have evaporated just pretty quickly. So that won't work. They don't have a way to explain it, and they admit that they don't. And of course, my flood model has it being across there after the flood. It's filled and evaporates, and then the water rises. Especially, we'll explain how it occurred, at least. There are several theories, of course. Loget et al. Claim that the regressive fluvial erosion was at the origin of the opening of the Strait of Gibraltar. One argument is that there was a river there that cut it, but there's not sufficient water to cut it that much. It had the ocean cut it. It's quite evident to me. Others claim tectonic activities caused it, but again, what happens with these atheists is one guy has a theory and somebody else shoots it down with arguments against it. So they argue against each other in this regard. Here's an artist sketch, and here's the artist named Pabahi, I think. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Here's the Straits of Gibraltar as it flowed out into this area in here. That's his artist sketch of it. I tried to give him credit for the artwork that he did. It's just an artist drawing of it. Garcia Castellanos et al. Claimed the water that flowed from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean flowed down a slope. Some of the earlier ones claimed that it went through a waterfall that was, but the water would flow over a mile. And I've read some of them saying you probably could hear it 400 or 500 miles away, the roar of it. But they claim that it wasn't a waterfall like that. So there's this disagreement there. They claim it went down the slope, and of course would cut the channel pretty quickly. They also claim that both the Nile and the Rhone That's a river coming out of France, cut the Undersea Canyons that we've already talked about in Chapter 9 at this time. And this is how they were cut there. Of course, they admit those canyons were cut at that time by rivers, but undersea canyons off the coast of the other continents, they don't know how they were cut. Of course, the tidal flood would have cut it. My tidal flood model would have cut those canyons. Here's a side view of it. And the water went to the Straits of Gibraltar and began to cut a channel. As it cut deeper and deeper, more and more water can flow into it. And of course, remember, it's going to lower the ocean by 40 feet as it cuts through and fills this back up. Here's a sill that's a high level area, like a windowsill, think of it that way. This water has to fill this up before it goes over here into this one, go to another one. And so it goes along Sicily, the Sicilian sill, and it has to go down and fill these up. These lower regions in here were areas where there's a lot of brine or sediment that is salty magnesium sediment, much like you'd see in the Dead Sea, or, well, it's a little bit different content than we have in Great Salt Lake, but much like the Dead Sea is what they see there and in these regions. The Fox flood model has the ocean rising due to fluvial lakes. Remember, after the flood, there was water trapped in various places, and as that water began, through the rainfall, began to rise, eventually it began to cut channels to get out into the ocean. I believe the Grand Canyon was cut this way. We've already seen other places cutting out to from Lake Bonneville out. We've already seen that, evidence of it. Even the atheists admit that occurred. The melting of the glaciers that were deposited during the flood. As these glaciers melted, the water runoff and began to raise the water level, and so the ocean level would rise. And then some of these places, there were ice dams. The water, as we've already seen in northern Russia, northern Europe, the ice would have dammed up and kept the water, forced it to go southward. And of course, once these ice dams were breached, the water then went into the oceans and raised them. We've already seen that in Lake Missoula in Montana, how there was a large glacier and there's a large lake there that formed, and then it opened up and cut through the what's called the scablands in eastern Washington. And we've been through that already and discussed that in detail. And the ocean levels rose sufficiently to breach the land linking Europe and Africa. The water flowing from the Atlantic Ocean into the Mediterranean Sea cut the Strait of Gibraltar. Well, flowing water can cut a channel through solid rock pretty quickly. It's very abrasive. You can cut things with water. With just high pressure water can cut things. It has that effect. That's why if you leave your faucet dripping, it'll just cut a channel and cut a groove in your faucet. That'll happen. The same time, that is within a few years, almost concurrent, the Black Sea began to flow into the Mediterranean as it filled up due to the same mechanisms of melting ice from the ice sheets in northern Europe and Russia and up into Siberia that flow through the Aral and in the Caspian and the Black Sea. Eventually that began to flow, and it filled the Black Sea to the point where it cut through the channel, through the Bosporus Straits, through the Dardanelles Straits into the Mediterranean. We've already seen the evidence that in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's a bunch of non-marine fossils. They're aquatic fossils coming out of the Black Sea, no doubt at that time. There's the breach, what we see here, as the water level builds up. Then it breaches. Remember, they argue, of course, this is based on good reasoning, the volume of the Mediterranean Sea, if it's empty, it would take enough volume, enough cubic miles of water to lower the oceans by about 40 feet. That's probably good math. Mathematically, it sounds reasonable to me. But there's your breach. This is looking to the west. This will be looking to the west. This will be the Iberian Peninsula. This will be Spain. Here's Gibraltar. And right over here is Africa in here. And that's exactly what we see here as it breaches. But the Caspian, Aral, and Black Seas were all connected. The melting ice was filling these three seas. And right here we see the ice sheets that were in North America and Northern Europe. We've already explained how those got there with our flood model. Notice here the brown areas, these are the areas along the seacoast, and that's the continental shelves. And this was above sea level. People lived in this region, and we know that because we have archaeological evidence of it. In other words, they found archaeological evidence of people living what is now 300 feet below sea level, that deep. So this was way out there. And then as this ice began to melt up here, and of course up here, and then began to rise, and finally it rose and breached this Strait of Gibraltar up here and refilled this area. Look over here in Australia. We've already looked at this before. This whole region was above the water. This was land, and it has now been covered by water since that time. Archaeological evidence showed people lived there, so we're not looking back millions of years as the atheist has to. The archaeology has been a great excitement to them because they have to admit people live there. And if we only evolved a million years ago, less than a million years ago, according to their dating, people had to have lived there and this had to have occurred. We shouldn't do additional research on the possibility there existed a land bridge across the Strait of Gibraltar after the flood. That's my contention. And by the flood, I mean the flood of Genesis. We should conduct further research and study on the possibility the land bridge was breached as the ice caps melted and the areas below sea level and parts of what is now the Mediterranean Sea were then flooded. Remember, we got several mechanisms here. We got the ice caps, we got the fluvial lakes flooding and then melting. We have this ice that's water that's melted on the south side of the ice sheets on the northern America, as well as in Russia and Europe. And eventually, once the ice melts sufficiently, the water flows out into the ocean and raises them. At the same time, we have the Mediterranean Sea being depleted because it doesn't have water flowing in. So it evaporates and that water goes into the ocean. All of that raises the ocean level. Finally, it goes over the top of the area where the Strait of Gibraltar is found and begin to cut through there. Any comments there? Additional research should consider the possibility the following events transpired after the flood. Mediterranean basin was filled with water from the tidal flood at the end of the flood. That's my contention. Land bridge across the Strait of Gibraltar, preventing water from flowing from the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. There was a land bridge between Asia and Europe across what is now Turkey, blocking the Strait of Bosporus, preventing the Black Sea from emptying into the Mediterranean Sea through the Aegean Sea, through the Straits of Bosporus and the Dardanelles Straits. Aral, Caspian, and Black Seas began to be filled with water, and they were connected, and their levels were higher than they are at present. They emptied into the Black Sea. The Mediterranean sea level began to lower because of evaporation. And these other lakes, these are the Black Sea, Caspian, and Aral Seas, because they have more water coming in than they have evaporation, they begin to rise. And so the lower, higher evaporation rate than we have inflow rate in the Mediterranean, it lowered, and that water is transferred out of the oceans, raising their levels. The water is confined to the lowest level of the basin, forming lakes that would rival the Dead Sea for mineral content. and bridge across the Strait of Bosphorus was finally breached after the melting of ice raised the levels of the three seas, allowing water to enter the Mediterranean, which raised the level of the Mediterranean Sea. Not fully, not enough to fill it, but did raise it. And then once that flow ceased, that sudden flow in ceased, there was one sudden flow. And that, of course, gave us the non-marine fossils that we find in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so it raised the Mediterranean a little bit, and then it began to evaporate again because the inflow out of the Black Sea then was not sufficient to overcome the evaporation rate. And so it went down level again. And finally, after that, then it breached the straits of what we know as Gibraltar. After this initial surge of water from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea again lowered, evaporation, as I said here, it raised this evaporation rate. This affected the climate in the region by decreasing the rainfall. This may explain the troubles that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had with the famines that occurred. May explain them. It may be linked with it, may not, however. The Straits of Gibraltar were finally breached as the ocean levels were raised by the melting ice caps in the Zankian Flood, according to Castellanos and et al. So the oceans were then lowered by at least 40 feet by the transfer of water from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. This sudden lowering of the sea level would affect marine life, such as corals. Some of the corals would have been that live near the surface would have been out of the water and they would have died. Remember, a coral is an animal, not a plant. And so when the corals died, the high ones that have higher in the ocean near the surface. And there are some corals that need to be deeper. They would be thrust up near the surface, and that some of them might die as well. So it would greatly adversely affect sea life, marine life, such as corals. These changes in the levels of Mediterranean oceans would then be followed by both volcanic and earthquake activity as they adjust the isostasy of the Earth. Remember, think of this way, isostasy. You step in a boat and the boat sinks into the water because of your weight. If it's not too big a boat, you can actually see it sink. You can see the sinking, and more people get in it, you can see it sink deeper into the water. That's what we're talking about with isostasy. And so once the water then comes out of the ocean into the Mediterranean, it pushes down on the Mediterranean seafloor, creating earthquakes and volcanoes in that region. And during that time period, there were lots of volcanoes in that region. So a lot of volcanic activity there. And this probably, the volcanic activity has been caused by this. It has to readjust to the levels, the pressure on top of the crust of the ocean floor, in this case, the Mediterranean seafloor. That would also affect such things as isostasy throughout the whole world, the ocean itself. Adjustments in the isostasy would cause both volcanoes and earthquakes from Pascal's law, but we've been through that already. Same principle of the hydraulic jack or hydraulic brakes on a car. Atheists have a problem with the dating of the filling of the Mediterranean basin. The reason is because Klotz and Korten say 110 feet below sea level, they found this cave. And then they can go down with other sources. Of course, divers can't go that deep with scuba gear, but they can with other gear and with the submarines. They can go down deeper and see it. And they found evidence that people were living much deeper than that. Of course, we've got the undersea archaeology all over the world, indicating a problem for the atheist. Second, the atheist Cloud states that the Mediterranean basin experienced its last refilling about 5.1 MYBP. That's million years before present. And of course, that time frame, I believe, is wrong. Why? Because obviously, even according to the atheist view, there were no humans alive. They hadn't evolved yet, according to their theory. So to live in this cave and make these cave drawings. So that's obviously wrong. Birkeland and Larson state 6 million years ago, and those are round numbers, the Mediterranean was isolated from the Atlantic Ocean. The sea quickly dried up, leaving a desert basin some 3,000 meters. That's 9,840 feet. And I've added that in, below sea level. And of course, that's pretty deep. That's nearly 2 miles deep. And then that water then went out into the oceans. The cave drawings are drawn within the last few thousand years, not millions of years. Keep that in mind. Atheistic time scale is off 3 orders of magnitude. Keep that in mind. YouTube link, you can write this down or see it, and you can find it. Of course, it's the atheist view of it, but they clarify a lot of things and verify a number of things that we've had in this study right here. And of course, this is a YouTube, and of course, keep in mind that it is done by atheists. In post-Diluvian times, the Mediterranean Sea, here's my summary, dried up because it was no longer linked to the oceans, the Atlantic Ocean in this case. This, of course, all your oceans are going together now. This, along with the melting ice caps, fluvial lakes flooding, such as Lake Bonneville, which flooded and left us what we call the Great Salt Lakes. Lake Bonneville was much larger and cut a path. We see the evidence of it, cut a channel. And even the Snake River was cut by ice floods of water, sudden floods. And ice dams melting, like we see, of course, at Lake Missoula. They raised the level of the oceans. And this breached the peninsula between Europe and Africa. Now, keep in mind here, the water transferred out of the Mediterranean into the oceans, raised them 40 feet. Melting ice caps for the lakes and the ice dams melting raised the levels of the ocean more. Finally, they breached the peninsula between Europe and Africa, cutting through the Gibraltar Strait and forming it and filling the Mediterranean Sea. This time, the ice sheets in Europe and northern Russia and western Siberia were melting and flowing south into the Caspian, Aral, and Black Seas. They couldn't flow into the Arctic Ocean because there was an ice dam there. When these seas were filled, the Black Sea cut a channel through the Bosporus Strait, floated the Mediterranean Sea through the Dardanelles Strait, bringing freshwater fossils into the eastern Mediterranean, not marine fossils, aquatic fossils, freshwater fossils, depositing them there. And that's part of my evidence supporting my contention of how the flood occurred. This is our lesson for tonight. Any questions or comments before I stop recording?